Hi, and welcome to the first webinar for the kindergartens to grade 1 group on the literacy project. And one of the things I want to talk about today is knowing who is in our classroom. And really this is about literacy screening. Screening our students to identify who our students are. Because often our groups are kind of made up of there's three main groups. There's the typical student who's in our class. And their skills are developing typically. You have the students whose skills are developing are exceeding the typical development, kind of head of the pack, and then you have those students who are behind the pack. And what's really important with screening is, the reason we use screening is so that we can identify who these different students are, because different students are going to need different amount of support. So those who are at the height of the class are going to need less support than those who are whose skills are still developing. And as we've talked about, literacy is a very complicated skill. There are so many things involved in literacy that the brain is working really, really hard to develop those skills. And as we've talked about over the last couple weeks and prior, is that literacy itself is not built up of a single skill. There are multiple skills that come together to allow us to be able to understand what we read and be able to express our ideas in the written format. And when we look at reading in particularly, we know that, again, there's stages in which we develop these skills. We've already kind of talked about this, but again, this is just for a quick review. Looking at the Carl Willows kind of stage of development, stage 0 is that emergent literacy stage. Now this is where students who are, kind of birth into the end of preschool, early kindergarten, this is where they're really learning our language, our oral language. Up to about a year age, they're really starting to focus in on the sounds of our language to be able to understand what those sounds are. They're before 8 months, the main thing that children are doing is they're really trying to pull apart what is actually just background noise, what is the sounds of doors shutting or a fan on, and what is actually language. So really working hard to trying to make those sense of those two. Then it's really developing of our oral skills and the actual vocabulary that we're using, as well as our ability to hear the unique sounds within our language, those phonemes that comprise our each individual word that we do. And so this is really going into kindergarten. As students enter kindergarten and go into grade 1, next they're really looking at, they're going from phonological awareness and concept of print. Now what they're really looking at is concept of print, still phonological awareness, but now the big thing is letter-sound correspondence, linking the sounds of our language onto graphemes, or the actual orthographic patterns, the written patterns of our language, and then learning the rules about how to use those orthographic patterns and start to blend them together to be able to get up to get words. As they move out of grade 1 and in grade 2 to 3, then really what they're doing is they're increasing their fluency of this of the ability to recognize words. So their ability to decode unfamiliar words, they're getting faster at doing that, but also they're getting faster at just seeing familiar words or high frequency words and automatically knowing what those words are. So automaticity or automation begins to kick in. And automation, as we talked about earlier, is really important because as something becomes automatic, it requires less and less and less of the cognitive resources to be able to carry out that skill. When a skill becomes automatic, we don't have to use much cognitive resources to that skill. We can use our cognitive resources for something else. And that something else in the terms of reading is our ability to understand what we're reading. So really kind of going from grade 3 into grade 4, reading comprehension really emerges as a person has those skills to be able to read accurately and fluently. And now the big thing is understanding and developing the strategies to identify key information within the passages that they're reading so that their understanding can emerge. And that's why I think for the literacy project, one of the big things is we're looking up to kind of the age of grade 3, because at the end of kind of grade 3, this is really where literacy, especially reading, needs to be consolidated so students have that ability to read, that skill of basic reading, so that they can continue to learn. From grade 4 onward, you really need that skill to learn, to be able to continue on your learning, because now the expectation is a teacher can provide you with a book. You can open that book and read that book and extract those ideas, and the teacher doesn't need to present you with those. So there's a huge change in the Ontario curriculum. Up to the end of grade 3 is really focused in on teaching students how to read. From grade 4 onward, you really need to have reading to continue to learn. And so, therefore, we need some screeners. We need some screeners to kind of start to identify where students are at, as well as we can use these screeners in what we call progress monitoring to monitor a student's progress as a skill develops. And because skills are developing at a different rate, we need different screeners based on where those students are. So, in kind of kindergarten, the main ones that we're using are initial sounds. So what happens is a teacher says a word and the student has to tell you what that word, the sound of that word is. There's letter naming, the ability to show a whole bunch of letters on the screen or on a page and having the student read those letters off as quickly as possible. Phoneme segmentation, hearing a word and being able to break that word into its individual phonemes. And then nonsense word reading, where I give you a word that it's not a real word, but it follows the conventions of English, and you have to read that word out loud. And that takes us from stage 0 and stage 1, and then halfway through stage 1, which is kind of going into grade 1, and really halfway through grade 1, we move over into oral reading fluency as our primary screening measure. And oral reading fluency is having a student read a passage that is at their grade level and see how many words they're able to read out loud accurately in a minute. Stage 2 to stage 3, so kind of end of grade 2 going into grade 3 and above, the day's task is a reading comprehension task where they'll be reading a sentence, and somewhere in the sentence there will be a word that is missing, and there will be 3 possibilities for what that word is, and the student has to circle it. And again, it's a time task because we're looking at fluency. How automatic is your skill of understanding? And we'll go into more details in those in a bit. Now, for any of these tests, what we have to do is we need to figure out where is, who is developed the skill and who hasn't developed that skill. And to do that, we use cut points. And what a cut point is works on this understanding that in anything that we measure, there's kind of a normal distribution, the wonderful normal curve that you probably saw in your first year psych classes, for those who took psych. In a normal distribution, the idea is that the majority of students developing a skill or developing anything, a majority of them will be all kind of around the middle. So if we were to line up a whole bunch of students in your classroom and to measure, let's say, height, you'd find that there's a whole bunch of students in your class who are all about the same height. Now, some of them will be advanced in that skill or that ability in terms of height. They'll be taller than the typical student, and then there'll be some who will be smaller than the typical student. So that will allow us to be able to see that there is different levels of development. So the top of the skill is when they're advanced, and the one when they're lower is they're below what is expected. So a cut point is somewhere in this distribution, we say people who are above this cut point, this score, they belong to one group, one category, and when they're below it, they belong to another category. And to be able to talk about cut points, what we do is we usually talk about percentiles. And a percentile is not a percentage. A percentage is how many questions you got right. A percentile is compared to other individuals my age, how do I do in that distribution, in that normal curve? Where do I sit? So if I score at the first percentile, that means I did as well or better than 1 out of 100 kids. But if I scored at the 65th percentile, that means I did as well or better than 65 out of, let's say, 100 kids. So I'm at the 65th percentile. I did as well or better than 65% of the students that were measured to create the norms for this test. When it comes to cut points, there's 2 cut points that are really important. The first is the 10th percentile, and the second one is the 20th percentile. The 10th percentile shows us, this is really our disabled group. This is the group that we're really worried about because that skill is really lagging behind. Students between the 10th percentile and the 20th percentile, or still under the 20th percentile, these are students that are at risk for further development or for future skill weakness. So 10th percentile kids we really have to pay a lot of attention to. Kids between the 10th and 20th percentile, we also need to pay attention to. All these students are really going to require more time, more repetition, more practice on that skill to develop that skill. When you're over the 20th percentile, then we are saying you're in the typical range, and therefore we don't have to worry about you as much in developing that skill. You'll probably continue to develop that skill on a typical trajectory. And again, going back to this 10th percentile and 20th percentile, the real reason that we want to pay attention to these students so much is because of the Matthew effect. And we've talked about this before. The Matthew effect say the richer get richer, the poor get poorer. Those students who are over the 20th percentile, they have your typical reading development. So on any of those literacy skills, their literacy skills will continue to get better over time. They'll keep going up and up and up and up. However, those students at the below the 20th percentile, well, they're your at-risk students. And what happens is, though their reading skills continue to develop over time, the rate at which they're developing they're not developing as quickly. And so, therefore, in the early ages, there might not be much of a difference. But as they go along, that difference gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it becomes a real problem, where they no longer have that skill, especially at kind of that grade 4 level. They don't have the skill of being able to read to allow them to keep up with the day-to-day tasks. So they don't have the skill to continue on the learning process, and so therefore other difficulties begin to emerge. So going back to our different stages, as I said, we have different tests that allow us to be able to identify what those different abilities are. And so what I want you to do this week is basically go in and start to practice learning some of these tasks. And what you'll see on the webpage is there are video links to the different tests that are available. Now, right after this video, there's also a video about how to sign up for Dibbles, and Dibbles is going to be the screener that we're going to use. And the reason we're using Dibbles is just because it's free. It's available to us, and that's wonderful. So we'll use it. It's also a very well-researched screener, so there's a lot of literature on its validity and reliability. Now, when we go to use one of these screeners, again, they're meant to be very easy for you to deploy within your classroom. So they're all basically 1 minute long. So using the Oral Reading Fluency screener, or ORF it's known as, which starts at kind of mid-grade 1, what you'll do is sit down with a student, you will get your stopwatch out, you will have a worksheet that the student is able to see, and then you'll have your own copy of the exact same passage. And you'll ask the student just to read out loud to you for 1 minute. So you'll time 1 minute. And as the student reads, if there's a word that they don't know how to read, or if they misread, then you simply put a slash through it, indicating that they didn't get it. You tell them word and they continue on. At the end of 1 minute, you stop, you indicate where the student got to, and then you count out the number of words that they read correct in that 1 minute, and that becomes your score. You then use the score. You can go to one of the norm charts to be able to see where were they. So you can look at words correct, how many words correct did they get, and you can see, are they, if they're above this number, then they're in the typical range. They're above the 20th percentile. If they're below that number, then they don't meet that cut point. So they're at risk of that skill not developing as well. If they're below the second number, then this is below the 10th percentile. So this is where you're at your real at-risk status comes out for those students. So those are what our two numbers are in terms of writing skills. What's going to be interesting as we start to do a lot more of the screening in the northern communities is to see, do the northern communities do you actually match onto what is seen in basically in the United States and southern Ontario? And that'll be something interesting for us to explore. What we can do is after, if you do a full class, we can actually develop your own cut points for your class to be able to identify within your class based on the students in your class being kind of the reference group, understand who is at the bottom 10, bottom 20%, or the kind of top 10%. And this is research to show that this is a very accurate way. So when we look at, especially like oral reading fluency, it is predictive of reading abilities and actually predictive of overall reading comprehension and academic abilities years in advance. So it's a very powerful way of being able to gauge trajectory. The other thing I kind of alluded to earlier was this idea of progress monitoring. So one thing that we can do with DIBELS is we can re-administer the test over and over and over again. So there's 20 passages for every grade level. So that means you can administer DIBELS 20 times. And what this allows you to do is you can literally chart a student's progress over time. Are they developing that skill as expected? And what we can also do is we can actually put a goal line for a student saying, okay, based on your starting point and based on the research we know, what should be your kind of general trajectory? We can then see, are you meeting that developmental skill, or are we going to need to do something? Do we need to change the program or introduce an intervention to be able to help you develop that skill and try and get you back up to it? So sometimes, such as in the case of the imaginary student here, they start off on the designated trajectory, but then their skill set kind of stalls, and so an intervention is brought in to try and help that skill, and there's shows some progress, and then they bring in another intervention to again trying to boost that progress to try and get that student back up to where the skill of where it would be expected. So take some time to log on to DIBELS right now. The next video is going to show you how to do that. Then watch the training videos. So download the material and watch the training videos. After watching the training videos, practice with one of your colleagues the different screeners. And once you're feeling comfortable with that, go out and try the screeners on a couple of the students in your classes. I'd say pick some that you think at the low, the middle, and the high end just to see how they do. And then in the following week, when we get together through the video conferencing, we'll be able to talk about our experiences using the screener.